The room was white, blindingly so. Light from the surgical lamp spilled across the metal surfaces, turning everything sterile and surreal. I lay on the cold, narrow operating table, the paper gown clinging to my skin, already damp from fear. The beeping of the heart monitor echoed in my ears like a war drum. Beep, beep, beep. Each pulse a reminder that time was slipping away and that I might never be the same again. I tried to focus, to stay grounded, but the air itself felt thick, pressing down on my chest. My body was strapped in at the arms and legs. A standard precaution, they told me, but it felt like punishment. A punishment for being the mother who never asked questions, who always obeyed. The nurse moved around me like a shadow, arranging surgical tools with soft metallic clinks that seemed far too loud. The scent of antiseptic hit the back of my throat, sharp and unforgiving. Dr. Evans, a calm man with sad eyes, stood nearby reviewing my file, the pages rustling like dry leaves. Through the fogged glass window, I saw Rebecca, my daughter-in-law, standing stiffly with her parents. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. Her gaze never left me. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I didn't need to. I could read the command written across her face like scripture. Sign it, do it, don't hesitate. And I had. The consent form was already signed, my name, Mary Jones, scrawled in shaky ink across the bottom line. My body would soon give a kidney to Adam, my oldest son. My life, once again, being offered up in silence. The nurse stepped forward with the anesthesia. The liquid shimmered inside the syringe, catching the surgical lights like mercury. I closed my eyes briefly and tried to inhale deeply, but the breath stuck in my lungs. I couldn't escape the sensation that I was sinking into something far more dangerous than surgery, something deeper, like betrayal. Adam was in the next room, frail and waiting. My child, my baby boy, and I loved him. I loved him with a ferocity only a mother could understand. But beneath that love, something else had taken root. A quiet, nameless panic. As if a part of me already knew I wasn't being told the whole truth. Then, it happened. A loud crash shattered the tension. The operating room door burst open with a violent screech that made the instrument tray rattle. The temperature dropped instantly, as if the hallway had exhaled a gust of winter air into the sterile room. All eyes turned. And there he was. Mario, my grandson, 9 years old. His school uniform was wrinkled, his shoes covered in mud. His small chest rose and fell in rapid gasps, his cheeks flushed with urgency and fear. A nurse ran after him, panic written all over her face. "Child, stop! You can't be in here!" But he didn't stop. He dodged around her and ran straight to me. His eyes wide, brown, and brimming with tears locked onto mine. He clutched something in his hand, a battered old cell phone with a cracked screen. I couldn't move, but my eyes followed him with all the strength I had. And then, in a voice so steady and raw that it sliced through the chaos, he said, "Grandma, I have to tell everyone why my dad really needs your kidney." The room froze. Even the machines seemed to hold their breath. The heart monitor beeped once sharper, louder. Then again, a pair of surgical forceps slipped from someone's hand and clattered to the floor with a deafening clang. Dr. Evans straightened, his hand raised. "Everyone stop!" I blinked, trying to sit up, but the straps held me. All I could do was stare at Mario, standing at the foot of the operating table like a tiny soldier about to deliver a secret that could topple a kingdom. Beyond the glass, Rebecca slammed her palm against the window, her voice shrill. "Don't listen to him, he's just a child!" But I could see the tremor in her posture. The mask was slipping. Her confidence, the icy control she always wore like a designer coat, was unraveling. Her parents stood beside her, faces pale, eyes darting between each other like cornered mice. Inside the room, Dr. Evans took a cautious step toward Mario. "Whatever you need to say it now." And still, Mario didn't speak, not yet. He just looked at me, eyes shining, fingers clenched around the phone. He was trembling, but he didn't run. He didn't cry. And in that moment, I saw something in him that stole my breath more than any anesthesia ever could. Courage. Real, bone-deep courage. My heart ached. I wanted to reach for him, hold him, shield him from whatever truth he had carried into this sterile nightmare. But I could only lie there, silent, captive to everything I hadn't dared question before. What truth could a child carry that would stop a surgery? What truth had I ignored for too long? And why? Why did it feel like this little boy was about to save my life? Mario didn't flinch beneath the weight of silence in the room. The phone in his small hand seemed too large for him, too heavy like the truth he was holding. His fingers clenched around it until his knuckles turned white. And yet, he looked only at me, not at the nurses, not at Dr. Evans, not at his mother Rebecca, who was now frantically pounding on the glass, just at me. His voice trembled, but it was sharp, clear. "Grandma, I have to tell everyone why my dad really needs your kidney." The air disappeared from the room. It was like someone had pressed pause on the world. The lights, the sounds, even the rhythmic beep-beep of the heart monitor stretched longer, louder, more ominous. One of the surgical assistants dropped a tool. No one bent down to pick it up. And all I could think, what could he possibly know? This boy, my Mario, the one I had spoon-fed warm rice porridge when he was teething, the one who used to nap curled like a kitten beside my armchair, the one who once cried when I got a paper cut, as though my pain was his pain. That same boy now stood here between me and the scalpel, trembling with a knowledge that didn't belong in the mind of a child. I tried to speak, to ask him what he meant. My throat was dry. My tongue felt like sandpaper against the roof of my mouth. The anesthesia hadn't touched me yet, but I was paralyzed. Rebecca's voice tore through the silence from behind the glass. "Don't listen to him. He's a kid. He doesn't know what he's saying. He's being manipulated." But her voice was shaking. Her hysteria had cracked the perfect porcelain doll I'd seen smiling over soup bowls and sweet talk. And that crack, it spread fast. Dr. Evans, still calm, turned to Mario. "Go ahead, son," he said, his voice deeper now, more urgent. "You can speak." And just as Mario's lips began to part, I was pulled under by memory. It was as if someone had cracked open my mind and let in a flood. I wasn't in the operating room anymore. I was back in my house, weeks earlier, in the middle of a cold Chicago afternoon. My knees ached from standing at the market that morning. I was seated at the kitchen table, peeling garlic while the rice toasted in the pot behind me. That familiar smell of slightly burned garlic and jasmine filled the room like incense. I remember how Rebecca walked in that day uninvited, no greeting, no warmth. Her words were blunt, like a slap. "The doctor says only your kidney is compatible. It's your responsibility now. You have to save Adam." She didn't say please. She didn't cry. There was no desperation, only coldness wrapped in obligation, like a bill collector. I dropped the spoon I was holding. The metal clanged against the pot and echoed in the silence between us. I stared at her, my heart pounding, hoping to see some sign of humanity in her eyes. But all I saw was control. "I know," I whispered hoarsely. "I'll do anything for Adam." She nodded, calculated, like a woman ticking off a box on a to-do list, and turned on her heels. 10 minutes later, her parents walked in without knocking, sitting themselves down like they owned the house. Mr. Collins leaned forward, his expression solemn. "A mother's duty is sacred," he said. "There are no excuses for abandoning your child in need. We're counting on you." Mrs. Peterson added, "This family's honor depends on you, Mary." Honor, duty, responsibility. All of it stacked onto my shoulders like bricks. I was 67, but in that moment I felt ancient. My joints screamed, but my heart screamed louder. That evening, I brought a bowl of warm soup to Joe, my husband, who hadn't spoken a full sentence in nearly a decade. His wheelchair creaked as I rolled him toward the back window. I wanted to ask him, "Am I doing the right thing?" But Joe just stared at the ivy crawling up the fence. He blinked once. Outside, Mario was playing with his little plastic cars, the same ones I'd found at a flea market for $3 the year before. He was on his knees in the dirt, making engine noises under his breath. But then, he stopped. He looked up at me. And with the strange seriousness that only children have when they're hiding something they don't know how to carry, he asked, "Grandma, what if someone gets sick because another person gives them medicine on purpose?" I froze. "What did you say, honey?" He didn't answer. He looked down again and resumed, pushing his car slowly along a crack in the concrete. I wanted to press him. I should have. But instead, I laughed nervously and said, "Don't worry. Your mom's just taking care of your dad. That's all." But the seed had been planted, and it was growing. The next morning, I rose with the Sunday. My legs ached from sewing all night. My eyes were still burning from tears I hadn't let fall. But I stood in the kitchen, brewing mint tea and pretending nothing was wrong, even as the dread settled deeper in my bones. Then Rebecca showed up, again, without knocking. She laid medical papers on the table like evidence in a trial. Charts, diagrams, signatures. "It's all here," she said coolly. "Only you can save Adam." I nodded numbly. I kept sweeping the floor, even though the broom barely touched the ground. It was the only thing I could do to stay upright, to not collapse under the weight of this invisible cage that was slowly closing around me. I said I would do it. But that night, in the silence of my tiny bedroom, I sat in the dark and wondered if I had already given too much. My blood, my bones, my best years. Was I now expected to give my organs too? And even then, I would have done it gladly. But something inside me whispered, "Ask why. Ask who benefits." I didn't listen. Not until Mario walked into that operating room. Not until that brave little boy stood before the surgeons, holding a broken phone and a truth too heavy for his 9-year-old shoulders. And I, his grandmother, the one who raised his father with the same love, the same sacrifice, could do nothing but lie there and wait for him to speak. I suppose I've always lived for other people. Even before Adam was born, before Brandon took his first step, before Joe's body became a prison of silence, I was someone who bore weight quietly, without complaint. That's how women like me are taught to survive. We bend, we stretch, we carry, and we don't ask why. We tell ourselves that strength means silence. I was 67 now, though my bones felt older. My back curved slightly, not from age, but from years of bending to scrub floors, lift crates of oranges at the market, push Joe's wheelchair down the uneven sidewalks of our neighborhood. My hands had long lost their softness. The skin was cracked, the nails short and uneven, the fingertips calloused from decades of work, gripping, sewing needles, peeling fruit, tying makeshift bags for neighbors who bought my vegetables because they pitied me or because they admired how I never seemed to complain. Our house wasn't much. A narrow 2-bedroom near the edge of Chicago's South Side. It always smelled faintly of liniment and medicinal herbs, camphor, eucalyptus, star anise. Joe had been confined to his wheelchair for over 10 years. And with every passing season, I stopped seeing the man I married and started seeing a shadow in the corner, present but unreachable. He rarely spoke now. His gaze drifted, and sometimes I wondered if his soul had quietly slipped out the back door when I wasn't looking. But once in a while, when I put his warm soup in front of him, he'd blink at me slowly, almost thoughtfully, and that was enough. That single blink carried years of shared memories. The first home we painted together. The nights we rocked Adam to sleep during his feverish childhood. The fights, the forgiveness, the life. I held all of that in my hands every time I touched his shoulder or wiped his face with a damp cloth. My world was built on rituals. Morning trips to the market at 5:30 a.m. to set up my stall before the sun burned through the morning fog. I sold fruits and vegetables in plastic crates I had reinforced with duct tape. The regulars would stop by Miss O'Hara with her scarf tied too tight, Mr. Lynn, who always asked for extra limes, and I would smile, bargain, hand over change, and return home with just enough money to buy rice and thread. The afternoons were for sewing. I stitched hems, mended cuffs, re-sewed buttons that had long given up on holding firm. I sewed for neighbors, for the nearby church, sometimes even for local businesses that needed uniforms adjusted. I didn't advertise. Word just spread. Go to Mary, she's quiet, but she's good. And when I wasn't stitching, I was cleaning. Mopping the sticky floors, scrubbing the windows, wiping the dusty frames of family photographs that reminded me of better days. The photo of Adam, age 6, wearing his father's oversized work boots. The one of Brandon in his high school cap and gown. The wedding photo, Joe and me, decades younger, hopeful. But it was always Adam who lit up those frames. My firstborn, the one I'd pinned all my dreams to. He was once strong, taller than all the other boys in our neighborhood, with a booming laugh and a way of spinning his younger brother around like a windmill. He worked in construction, always coming home with the scent of cement and sunburn on his skin. He made jokes, danced with me in the kitchen, even fixed the front fence when the wind knocked it down. But over the years, his fire dulled. The laughter stopped coming home with him, his skin paled, and he moved more slowly. At first, it was just fatigue. Then came the dark circles under his eyes, the weight loss, the blood in his urine. The day he told me that, I felt something snap inside my chest. "Don't worry, Mom," he said, his smile so weak I wanted to slap it away. "It's just from working too hard. Rebecca's got it under control." Rebecca. She came into our lives like a breeze that suddenly slams the door shut. Beautiful, articulate, educated. She treated Adam like glass at first, watched his meals, timed his pills, made soft small talk in a tone that made everyone think she was an angel. Even the neighbors told me, "You're so lucky, Mary. Not every mother-in-law gets a daughter-in-law like that." I smiled and nodded. What else could I do? There were moments brief, flickering when I questioned that perfection. Like the night I found her in the backyard, whispering on the phone near the lemon tree. I only caught a sliver of her words. "Don't worry, everything's going according to the plan." When I asked who she was talking to, she laughed a little too quickly and brushed it off. "Just a friend, Mom. Go back to bed." And I did. Because when you spend your life carrying others, you stop trusting your instincts. You start telling yourself that unease is just tiredness, that suspicion is just exhaustion, that what you saw, what you heard, doesn't really mean anything. I buried my instincts. For Adam. But Brandon. Brandon saw things differently. My younger son had always been quiet, watchful. A plumber and electrician, he lived just a few blocks away and came by often. He never had much to say, but he always brought something: fresh bread, fruit, an extra light bulb for the kitchen ceiling that buzzed too much. One afternoon, as he changed the fuse in the back room, he looked at me and said in a low voice, "Mom, don't wear yourself out like this. You're not a machine." I waved him off, smiling like I always did. "I can still handle it, Brandon. Your brother needs you more." But Brandon just stared at me for a long moment, the silence saying what his mouth wouldn't. "You're not just tired. You're disappearing." And in truth, I was. Every night, I lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, thinking, is this all there is? Not once in 67 years had I asked for anything. Not rest, not thanks, not love in return. I just gave, and gave. And now they were asking for my body, my kidney, without hesitation, as if I didn't even have the right to pause and breathe. But I would have done it. For Adam I would have. I still might have. If not for Mario. My Mario, whose tiny hands now held a truth so heavy, it had the power to break everything open. And maybe, just maybe, that was what we needed. Adam was always the strongest of my boys. He had Joe's build, broad shoulders, square jaw, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that turned heads at the grocery store. In his 20s, he could lift a bag of cement on each shoulder and still have enough breath to whistle through his teeth. The neighborhood boys followed him like he was a local legend. To me, he wasn't just a son, he was a symbol of everything I had worked for, suffered for. But strength has a way of crumbling when you least expect it. At first, I told myself it was just exhaustion. Adam had always worked hard, sometimes too hard. A foreman on construction sites, he was often out before sunrise and home well after dusk. "It's the job," he'd say with a crooked smile when I pointed out the dark circles under his eyes. But when he started to cough at night, when his weight dropped faster than the autumn leaves in the backyard, when he told me he'd started urinating blood, I felt my stomach turn to stone. "Tell me what's wrong, son," I begged one night. I took his face in my hands. His skin was clammy, his eyes sunken like little wells. "Is it something serious?" "Just wear and tear, Mom," he whispered. "Rebecca says it's probably nothing." Rebecca. By then, she had already embedded herself into every crevice of our family. She arrived years earlier like a gentle spring breeze, polished, elegant, soft-spoken. She had a calm voice and a warm smile, the kind that disarms suspicion before it ever forms. At first, I thought I'd hit the jackpot, a daughter-in-law who helped set the table, remembered my birthday, made Adam drink his vitamins without fuss. She brought home organic vegetables and special supplements. She hovered over Adam like a devoted nurse. She measured his blood pressure every morning and tracked it in a neat little notebook. She made herbal teas, lit candles scented with lavender, whispered encouragements. And I believed her. I wanted to believe her. All the neighbors did too. "You're lucky, Mary," they'd say. "Not all daughters-in-law take care like that." And I'd nod, offering polite smiles, though something inside me was growing, off. Like fruit that looked perfect on the outside, but had started to rot within. One night, long after everyone had gone to bed, I woke to the sound of hushed voices in the backyard. I peeked through the curtain and saw Rebecca pacing under the streetlight, phone pressed to her ear. I said, "Don't worry. Everything is going according to the plan," she whispered. The sentence hit me like a slap. My chest tightened. My instincts flared. The next morning, over breakfast, I asked casually, "Rebecca, who were you talking to last night?" She blinked, laughed nervously. "Just a friend, Mom. I was venting about work. Go back to sleep." And like a fool, I did. Because when you've built your life around trust and sacrifice, your first instinct is always to protect the illusion of harmony. It's easier to believe a lie dressed in politeness than face a truth that would unravel everything. But the shadows only deepened. Adam grew thinner. His skin turned a sickly gray, and his energy evaporated. He could barely make it to the bathroom without help. Yet, Rebecca remained composed, never frantic, never panicked. Always in control. She insisted he didn't need hospitalization, that home remedies were best, that the stress of doctors would make things worse. She began to speak for him, at the dinner table, at the pharmacy, even with Brandon. Brandon, my younger son, saw it first. He wasn't book-smart like Adam, but he had the kind of intelligence that lives in the fingertips in how he fixed broken fans, in how he read people like blueprints. One evening, while helping me replace a busted kitchen light, he asked, "Do you trust Rebecca?" The question chilled me. I didn't answer. He sighed and leaned down to his toolbox. "She's always watching Adam's pills like she's guarding treasure. And I saw her throw something in the trash last week, an empty bottle with no label. When I asked her, she said it was vitamins. But Mom, I know medicine. That wasn't vitamins." Still, I said nothing. Because saying something meant tearing open the curtain. And behind that curtain, I feared what I might find. Rebecca's control only tightened when the doctors confirmed what she had already guessed. Adam's kidneys were failing. And out of everyone tested, I was the only compatible match. Me, the mother who had already given everything else. "It's your duty," she said one day, standing in my kitchen as if it were hers. She didn't plead. She didn't ask. She instructed. And for a while, I believed I had no choice. What I didn't know was that Mario, my sweet grandson, was already watching. He was listening, absorbing, noticing things that adults brushed off as background noise. And somewhere along the line, Mario started putting pieces together. But I was still blind. All I could see was Adam's face, thin and lifeless on the living room couch. His eyes, glassy and exhausted, still trying to muster a smile. "I trust you, Mom," he whispered. And that trust, it broke me. Because I didn't know if he meant it, or if he even could mean it anymore. The day the papers landed on my kitchen table was the day my body stopped feeling like my own. I had just taken the kettle off the stove when Rebecca walked in, unannounced as always. She didn't smile. She didn't even glance at me. She moved like a woman on a deadline, tight, composed, rehearsed. "Mom," she said with that too calm voice that always made my skin crawl. "The doctor says there isn't much time left. If we wait too long, it might be too late." She dropped a thick folder onto the table with a thud that made me flinch. Charts, numbers, scanned documents with official seals. At a glance, it looked convincing. But I didn't need papers to tell me Adam was dying. I could see it every time I looked into his sunken eyes. Rebecca flipped through the sheets and pointed with her manicured finger. "It's all here. You're the only compatible one. No one else. Not even Brandon." She didn't look up from the pages. She didn't ask. She presented. I stood there with the teapot in my hands, the steam rising past my cheeks like smoke from a fire I couldn't see yet. The ceramic began to burn my fingers, but I didn't move. I wasn't shocked by what she said. What shocked me was how she said it. There was no emotion, no grief, just certainty. Like this was a transaction, like I was a tool. "I heard you," I murmured, finally setting the teapot down and reaching for the broom because if I kept sweeping, I wouldn't have to look her in the eyes. Rebecca stood silently, her arms crossed, watching me, waiting. The broom scraped across the floor in slow, hollow strokes, the rhythm matching the thud of my heart. I felt like a child again, being scolded for something I didn't understand. I wanted to scream, to shout, to cry that I needed more time, that I was afraid, that this was my body. But all I could manage was silence. That night, I lay awake on my old mattress, staring at the ceiling fan Brandon had fixed months earlier. The blades spun like thoughts I couldn't slow down. I kept hearing Adam's weak voice in my head. "Mom, I trust you." Trust. That word was both a blessing and a curse. The next evening, Rebecca's parents arrived, Mr. Collins and Mrs. Peterson, dressed as if attending some formal event instead of barging into my home. They brought a basket of fruit, mangoes, and oranges, but they placed it on the table like an afterthought, a prop in a scene they had rehearsed. They sat in the two main chairs of the living room like royalty. Mrs. Peterson's voice came first, sharp and rehearsed. "When I was a child, my grandmother sold all her land to save her son. That's what real mothers do." I stood in the corner, half shadowed by the dim lamplight, my apron still dusted with flour, the smell of stew still lingering in the air, and I wanted to ask, "What have you ever given up for your family?" But I didn't. Mr. Collins cleared his throat. "Mary, we all know this family is held together by your sacrifice. Don't let us down now." That's when I realized they weren't just visiting. They were circling me, like wolves. I sat down slowly, my knees aching from a full day at the market. The edge of the table bit into my palms. The weight of 3 expectant faces pressed into my chest like a boulder. And just beyond the dining room, Adam sat in a chair by the window, skeletal and pale, a blanket over his shoulders like a shroud. "Mom," he whispered, "I trust you'll save me." His voice was so fragile, so childlike, I felt my breath hitch. I looked into his eyes and saw the boy he used to be, the one who built forts out of bedsheets, the one who drew stick figures of us holding hands. His eyes now were hollow, pleading. "I will," I said, but my voice was no louder than a breath. The room felt like it was closing in. The stale scent of dried herbs from Joe's teacup filled my nostrils, and suddenly, I couldn't breathe. I rose quickly, almost knocking over the fruit basket. I fled to the backyard, where the air was cooler, where Mario sat cross-legged with his toy cars. He looked up at me with those round, earnest eyes. "Grandma," he said softly, "what if someone gets sick because someone else is giving them medicine they shouldn't take?" I froze. Again. The same question. The same weight. This time more direct, more pointed. "Why would you ask that, Mario?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He shrugged, pushing a car through the dirt. "I just heard Mom say something. I didn't understand, but it sounded bad." I touched his shoulder gently. "Don't worry about grown-up things, sweetheart." But inside, I was crumbling. What was I doing? Was I really going to give away a part of my body when I didn't know who was telling me the truth? When whispers were swirling in every corner of this house like smoke from a fire yet to reach me? Over the next few days, I tried to push it all down. I went back to the market. I sewed until midnight. I baked bread for Joe and stitched the lining of Adam's old jacket, but every breath I took felt heavier, like I was inhaling guilt. Rebecca returned again, this time early in the morning, just as I was steeping spearmint leaves in hot water. She walked in without knocking, as usual. "There isn't much time," she said. "If you keep hesitating, it could be too late." Her words weren't a plea. They were a deadline. I nodded, but it was an empty gesture. Because something inside me was beginning to change. I no longer felt like the woman who simply obeyed. I felt like a woman being asked to die. Mario had always been the quiet light in our heavy house. He had a gentleness about him, curious but never intrusive, thoughtful beyond his years. He didn't cry often, but when he did, it was as if he carried the sadness of everyone around him. He'd watch me cook, play with his toy cars at my feet, and sometimes hum a tune he invented on the spot. His presence soothed me in ways even my own children could not. But lately, Mario had changed. He was still sweet, still loving, but there was something behind his eyes now. Something he didn't know how to name. A flicker of confusion, a quiet fear, the kind of worry a child should never have to carry. One afternoon, as I was peeling onions at the kitchen counter, Mario came in and set his old backpack down with a thump. His face was flushed, not from playing outside, but from something else. He didn't reach for his toys or sit at the table like usual. Instead, he stood there silently, watching me. "Everything okay, mijo?" I asked, drying my hands. He nodded slowly, then sat down and started tracing invisible patterns on the table with his finger. "Grandma," he said without looking up, "what if my dad isn't sick because of life, but because someone's making him sick on purpose?" The words knocked the breath from my chest. The knife slipped from my hand and clattered against the counter. I turned to him. "Why would you say that?" He shrugged. "I heard Mom talking again. She was on the phone. She said something about medicine, about timing. I don't know. But she was whispering like she didn't want anyone to hear." His little shoulders hunched inward. His fingers gripped the edge of the table. I wanted to scoop him into my arms and tell him everything was okay. But I couldn't lie to him, not when my own heart was already drowning in doubt. I knelt beside him, brushed the hair from his forehead, and tried to smile. Maybe she was just talking to the doctor, cariño. Sometimes adults sound strange when they're tired. He didn't believe me. He didn't argue, but he didn't believe me. He just looked at me with those eyes that were too old for his age, and then quietly left the room. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the bowl of onions I no longer had the strength to chop. That night, sleep evaded me. I tossed beneath the thin blanket, the ceiling fan's slow whir echoing the churn of my thoughts. Mario's words looped in my mind. "Because someone's making him sick." I wanted to scream, or cry, or burst into Joe's silent room and demand he speak, just once, and tell me I wasn't going mad. But he remained still, breathing, watching, always watching, never answering. The next day, Brandon came by with his toolbox. Said he was here to fix the flickering kitchen light again, though it had only started acting up the day before. I think he just needed an excuse to come close. To talk. As he unscrewed the bulb and tested the wires, I noticed his face. Drawn. Serious. "Mom," he said without turning around, "have you noticed anything off about Rebecca lately?" I hesitated. "Like what?" He came down from the ladder slowly and stood in front of me, holding the burnt-out bulb like it was something fragile. "I was at Adam's last week. I saw her putting away some pill bottles, white ones, no labels. When she noticed me watching, she slammed the cabinet shut. My hands clenched the edge of the sink. "Are you sure?" I asked, even though my heart already knew the answer. He nodded grimly. I checked again when she left the room. There were 3 different bottles, all unmarked. I didn't recognize the pills, and I work with enough people on pain meds to know when something looks off. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt like sand. "She said they were vitamins," I whispered. "I saw her give Adam one. She said the doctor prescribed it." Brandon frowned. "I called the clinic yesterday, pretended I was checking on Adam's file. They said no new prescriptions were added, only his dialysis meds. That's it." The air in the kitchen turned cold. My knees buckled slightly, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. "Mom," Brandon said softly, "I think she's doing something to him. I think she's the reason he's getting worse." I shook my head slowly, not because I disagreed, but because I couldn't believe it. Didn't want to believe it. But everything, the whispered calls, the unlabeled bottles, Mario's question, the pressure to operate before it was too late. It was all starting to look like a trail I had ignored for far too long. I leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of all those years pressing down on me at once. The market stalls, the sewing needle pricks, the long nights of rocking sick children to sleep. And now, this. Was this the reward for all I had given? Brandon stepped closer, placing the bulb gently on the table. "I'll help you, Mom," he said, "but we need to know what we're dealing with." And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. We were standing on the edge of a truth that could destroy our family, and we had no choice but to walk toward it. The next afternoon, I brought a bowl of soup to Adam's hospital room, his favorite rice and stewed chicken, simmered with garlic, onions, and a touch of cumin. The smell filled the car on the way there, curling up from the old plastic container like steam from a memory. It was the same meal I used to cook when he was a child recovering from the flu, the one he once called healing soup. I wanted it to mean something again. But when I stepped into that sterile, white-walled room, the scent seemed out of place, foreign. The air was thick with disinfectant. The windows were closed, the blinds drawn. Machines beeped in quiet rhythm, almost like lullabies for the dying. Adam was there, hooked up to IVs, thinner than ever. His skin had the pale, grayish tint of wax paper. Yet somehow, when he saw me, he smiled, weakly, but real. "Mom," he whispered, "you came." I tried to smile back. My lips trembled. Rebecca was already in the room, standing beside him, holding a glass of water. She looked polished, calm, as if this were just another errand on her list. But as I approached, something in her hand caught my eye, a quick flick of movement. I saw her drop something into the glass. A pill. It was fast, so fast I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't been looking. She must have sensed it too, because when she turned and saw me, she flinched. The glass in her hand tilted slightly, and a small splash of water dribbled onto the floor. "What was that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. She didn't miss a beat. "Oh, just a kidney supplement. The doctor said it might help strengthen him for the surgery." My stomach turned. I looked at the glass. The water was faintly cloudy, but not enough for anyone else to question it. Rebecca's smile stretched across her face, too tight, too rehearsed. I said nothing. Instead, I waited until she left the room under the excuse of checking on paperwork, then quietly made my way to the nurse's station. A middle-aged doctor stood nearby, reading through a clipboard. He looked exhausted but kind. "Excuse me," I said softly. I was just wondering. Has the hospital prescribed any new kidney supplements for my son, Adam?" He furrowed his brow. "Let me check." He flipped through a few pages. "No, ma'am, nothing new. He's only on his dialysis medications and a few anti-inflammatories. That's it." "Why do you ask?" I couldn't speak. My throat closed. I nodded politely and walked away. Inside, everything was shattering. When I returned to the room, Adam had fallen asleep. His chest rose and fell in shallow movements. He looked peaceful but fragile. Like if I touched him too hard, he might crumble into dust. That night, back home, I couldn't sleep. I paced the kitchen tiles in my socks until the floor grew cold. My thoughts raced faster than I could catch them. I saw the pill, the cloudy water, Rebecca's smile, the doctor's confused face. I was still reeling when I heard a knock on the back door. It was Mario. He stood there in his pajamas, clutching his tattered backpack like a soldier returning from war. "Grandma," he said, his voice small, "I want you to hear something." He unzipped the backpack, pulled out a cracked old cell phone, and sat down at the table. His fingers trembled slightly as he tapped on the screen. Then, he handed it to me. "Just listen." A recording began to play. Rebecca's voice, whispered, calm, but unmistakable. "After the transplant, the test results will be perfect. Don't worry, she won't dare refuse." My blood ran cold. I stared at the phone like it had come to life. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. Mario watched me, eyes wide, lip trembling. "I found it on Mom's old phone," he whispered. "I didn't know what it meant, but I thought you should know." I reached for him, pulled him into my arms. He buried his face in my neck and sobbed. "You're so brave, Mario," I whispered into his hair. So brave. But inside, I was breaking. That voice, that sentence, "After the transplant, she won't dare refuse." It wasn't just planning, it was manipulation, a strategy, something premeditated. Suddenly, all the moments I had ignored came flooding back. Rebecca watching me sign the consent form, her silence when I questioned the pills, the midnight phone calls, her parents treating my living room like a boardroom. It wasn't love. It was control. It wasn't duty. It was design. And I had almost walked right into it. I had almost laid down on that table, let them take my kidney, given up my own life to fuel whatever dark plan they were constructing behind the curtain. I stayed awake all night, sitting in my kitchen with the lights off. Just me. And the truth. And the decision I knew I would have to make soon. The sky that night was swollen with clouds. The kind of sky that never fully darkens, just sits there, heavy, waiting to rain. I sat in my small bedroom with the curtains open, watching that sky press down on the houses, on the roofs, on the people who slept soundly in homes filled with peace. My hands were trembling as I lit the oil lamp. Its flame flickered, fragile, but persistent like the parts of me I thought I had already given away. On the table in front of me was a stack of documents I could barely read, a pen with dried ink at the tip, and an old wooden box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were the remnants of another life, my wedding handkerchief, a photo of Joe and me when our eyes still held light, a pressed flower Adam had once given me after scraping his knee and crying in my arms. And now, I was preparing to write my will. I pulled a clean sheet of paper from the drawer and began with a shaking hand. To Brandon, I leave the house. To Mario, the small gold necklace I've worn since I was a girl. To Adam, if he survives, I leave my forgiveness. Each word felt like a stone on my chest. Each sentence, a goodbye. In the corner of the room, Joe sat in his wheelchair silent, as always. The lamp's glow illuminated the gauntness of his face, the deep hollows under his eyes. I looked at him, willing him to speak, to grunt, to blink twice, anything. "Joe," I whispered, folding the paper, "if I don't wake up from that table tomorrow, promise me you'll watch over the boys." He didn't answer. But just before I turned away, I saw one tear, just one slide down his cheek. That was enough. I slid the will into the wooden box and locked it. Then I blew out the lamp and let the night cover me like a funeral cloth. Kan Kellen spakte doing it. At dawn, I stood outside the house with a small fabric bag in my hand, just a change of clothes, a bottle of water, and the embroidered handkerchief from my wedding day. The ambulance pulled up quietly, almost respectfully. I climbed in without a word. Inside, the air was frigid. The streetlights outside blurred into ribbons of gold and gray through the window, like a film reel playing backward. Every bump in the road rattled through my spine. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't. When we reached the hospital, a nurse wheeled me down a long corridor that smelled of bleach and fear. The gurney's wheels squeaked like they were protesting, like they knew where we were going and didn't want to take me there. Behind me, I heard heels clicking on the floor. Rebecca. She followed me like a shadow, calm, efficient, in control. At one point, she leaned over me and whispered, "Don't worry, Mom. After today, everything will be better." But I saw it in her eyes, that glint of triumph, the kind you see when someone wins a game you didn't know you were playing. At the reception, her parents were already waiting. Mr. Collins wore a suit too formal for a hospital visit. Mrs. Peterson had on a bright red dress, as if this were a wedding and not a surgery. They smiled. They shook hands with the doctors. They laughed. I stood there, holding my bag, feeling like a stranger to them, like a guest at my own execution. Before the operation, they let me see Adam. He was lying in a dim waiting room, IVs in both arms, his lips dry, his skin paper-thin. But when he saw me, he tried to smile. "Mom," he whispered. "Thank you." I took his hand. It was cold, almost too cold. I wanted to hold him forever, to curl him up in my lap like I used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. I wanted to say, "Your wife is killing you," but I didn't, because the boy I once knew was still in there, and his love for her, it was still real. I brushed his hair back and said, "Sleep. I'll be here when you wake up." My voice cracked as I lied. Just as they wheeled me toward the operating room, the doors burst open. Brandon came running down the hallway, grease still on his hands, shirt drenched in sweat. "Mom," he shouted, gripping my arm. "Don't do it. I beg you. Don't donate your kidney. Something isn't right." His eyes were wild with fear, his voice echoing down the sterile walls. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream that I already knew, that I had known for days, that I had already signed everything because I thought I had no choice. But all I could do was place my hand gently over his and whisper, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. I was terrified, but I let the nurse pull me away. Brandon's voice rang behind me. "Mom, please listen to me." I didn't turn back. I didn't dare, because if I looked into his eyes, I would break, and I couldn't afford to break, not until I knew for sure. The hallway stretched endlessly, a tunnel of blue gowns, white lights, and cold steel. I heard the buzz of a surgical lamp being turned on, the rustle of gloves, the clink of instruments. They led me into a changing room. I slipped into the blue gown. A nurse tied the back. I looked in the mirror. There was a woman staring back at me, but she didn't look like me. She looked like someone who had already been buried. My hair was flat against my scalp. My cheeks were hollow. My eyes, ringed with sleeplessness, stared wide, as if asking, "Is this how it ends?" And still, I didn't cry. Because something was coming. I didn't know what. But something was building. In the reflection, I saw them. Rebecca and Mrs. Peterson, standing outside the OR glass, speaking to a man in a black jacket and cap. The same man from Brandon's photo. The man from the parking lot. I watched her hand him an envelope. He tucked it into his coat and disappeared. That was when my pulse started racing. I hadn't been wrong. This wasn't just desperation. This wasn't just illness. It was something much darker. But I was already inside. Already on the table. Already seconds from sleep. The operating room was so white it almost hurt to look at. Bright surgical lights bathed everything in antiseptic glow. The metal tools gleamed too sharp, too perfect. The room smelled like ammonia and cold air, no warmth, no trace of anything human. I lay there on the gurney, arms strapped gently at the sides, a nurse adjusting the heart monitor beside me. Beep, beep, beep. Steady, too steady, like it didn't belong to me. Dr. Evans hovered above with a clipboard and a calm smile. He was kind, everyone said so. But his face now was blank, rehearsed. The way someone looks when they've already disconnected from your pain. He asked the usual pre-op questions. Date of birth? Any allergies? Have you eaten since midnight? I answered robotically. My voice was hoarse, barely audible. Then he nodded to the anesthesiologist. A woman in green scrubs stepped forward and said gently, "You'll feel a little pinch." I watched the syringe come close to my arm, the needle glinting like a silver snake's fang. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, urgent, too loud for a place built to muffle panic. The OR doors slammed open. "Mom!" Mario's voice cracked as he burst into the room, his small face flushed, eyes wide, his chest rising and falling like he'd run a marathon. Everything stopped. Nurses froze. Dr. Evans looked up, startled. The anesthesiologist dropped the syringe to the tray with a clink. Behind Mario, Brandon rushed in, out of breath, holding a crumpled folder in his hand. "Mom, don't do it," he shouted. "Stop the surgery. We have proof." The silence in the room broke like glass. Mario ran to me, tears streaking his cheeks. He shoved a phone into Dr. Evans's hands. "Listen," he begged. "You need to hear it." Evans hesitated, then pressed play. Rebecca's voice filled the room. "After the transplant, the test results will be perfect. Don't worry, she won't dare refuse." And another. "The insurance money clears once she signs the final consent." A third. "We just need her kidney, that's all. After that, Adam's condition won't matter." Every person in that room heard it. The nurses gasped. The anesthesiologist stepped back, hand over her mouth. Dr. Evans' face drained of color. Brandon moved beside him and opened the folder. "My name's Brandon Cortez. I'm the donor's son. These are photos of Rebecca handing off documents to a known medical trial recruiter. She's not trying to save my brother. She's using this surgery to enroll him in an illegal pharmaceutical test, and she's trying to take our mother's kidney under false pretenses." The silence that followed was not relief, it was horror. Dr. Evans turned to the head nurse. "Suspend the operation immediately, get hospital security, and contact administration, now." He turned to me next, his voice gentle but shaken. "Mrs. Cortez, you're safe now. You're not going under, I promise." My body rigid with fear just moments before sagged. I hadn't even realized I was crying until I felt the wetness on my cheeks. Brandon rushed to my side, taking my hand. Mario climbed up beside me and hugged my arm tightly. The room emptied fast. Rebecca never entered the OR. Security stopped her outside, where she was pacing with her parents and the stranger in the black cap. I watched through the glass as the hospital director arrived, flanked by two men in uniforms. One of them opened a folder and began speaking to Rebecca's parents. Her mother turned pale. Her father tried to argue, but within minutes, All three were being escorted toward the elevators. Rebecca didn't scream, didn't cry. She simply stared at me through the glass. For one long second, eye to eye. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sorry. She was furious that I had figured it out, that I hadn't laid down and died the way she wanted, that I had lived. And then, she was gone. The OR lights dimmed. The instruments were wheeled away. The heart monitor was silenced. I sat up slowly, still in my gown, still in disbelief. Brandon helped me off the table. Mario clung to my waist. "Come on, Mom," Brandon said, voice thick with emotion. "Let's go home." But I couldn't move, not yet. I looked around the operating room, this sterile chamber that had almost taken my life. And I thought of every woman like me. Every mother who gave until there was nothing left. Every grandmother told to be quiet. Every woman gaslit, guilt-tripped, manipulated in the name of duty. And I realized something simple but life-altering. I was done sacrificing myself. From now on, they would answer to me. 2 days had passed since the surgery that never was. I was back in my own home, in my own kitchen, wrapped in the scent of ginger tea and warm toast. Outside, sunlight poured through the windows like forgiveness. Everything was quiet, peaceful, almost too peaceful. Joe sat beside me at the table, a blanket over his knees, his eyes tracking the birds outside. I reached over and placed my hand over his fingers twitched, faintly. That was enough for me. The doorbell rang. Brandon opened the door to reveal Mario, carrying a brown envelope. He looked more serious than I'd ever seen him. His small shoulders pulled back, his eyes steady. "I got this from the hospital lawyer," he said. Inside were papers, legal ones. Documents that confirmed what we already knew. Rebecca had enrolled Adam in an unapproved pharmaceutical trial in exchange for a large cash payout. The kidney transplant would have masked the drug's side effects. I had been nothing more than a means to an end. The evidence was overwhelming. The voice recordings, the photos, the bank transfers, all of it compiled thanks to Mario, a child who had seen through the adults' lies. I hugged him, not like a child, but like a soldier returning home. "You saved me," I whispered. "You saved us all." He didn't say anything, just nodded, like he already knew. "That's no bray." The next day, we held a family meeting in my living room. Adam had been moved to a different hospital and placed under the supervision of neutral doctors. Brandon had arranged for new counsel to represent him and possibly challenge the experimental trial's ethics. I had signed new documents too, but not the kind Rebecca wanted. These were for power of attorney, financial guardianship, and medical decision-making. Everything she once tried to strip from me, I had now taken back legally, officially, and without apology. I wasn't vengeful, just awake. When the lawyer handed me the final papers to sign, I paused. For a long moment. Then I asked, "Can I add one clause?" He raised an eyebrow. "Of course." I leaned in and whispered, "Make sure my will clearly states, no one touches a thing unless Mario approves it first." The lawyer chuckled. "That's unusual." I smiled. "So is he. Every take like in Destraim, and we have now wide, and weed, and why do." A week later, Rebecca's trial began. It was all over the news. Daughter-in-law accused of medical fraud and coercion in transplant scam. Her photo was everywhere, her once perfect image now framed in grainy courthouse lighting. She didn't speak to me when she passed in the hallway, but I looked her in the eye, just once. Not with hatred, but with clarity. She had underestimated the quiet woman who always made the soup, held the coats, and nodded politely in family meetings. She forgot that women like me hold stories, and survival, and memory. As the cityers, I think it was not Iglite the city. On Sunday, we had dinner, just the four of us, me, Brandon, Mario, and Joe. No fancy dishes, just rice, beans, roasted chicken, and a slice of apple pie. Mario asked if he could say grace. We all bowed our heads. "Thank you," he said softly, "for letting Grandma live." I couldn't help it. I cried into my napkin. Not from sadness, but from something I hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Because I had survived not just the surgery, but the silence. And I had walked out not just alive, but awake.